In 1983, a magazine paid 9 million marks for Adolf Hitler's private diaries. Historians were fascinated and swore they were genuine. Newspapers across 2 continents printed them. Every page was written by one man at his kitchen table, and who he was will shock you. April 1983. The German magazine Stern calls a press conference and tells the world it has found Adolf Hitler's private diaries. 62 volumes, written in his own hand, missing since the day Berlin fell. This is the biggest story any journalist could ever hold. 13 years of a dictator writing down what he really thought. Every history book about the Second World War would have to be opened again and corrected. Stern paid 9.3 million marks for them. Rupert Murdoch bought the British rights. Paris Match bought France. Papers in Spain, Italy, Norway, and the Netherlands all queued up. Nobody wanted to be the one who missed this. To prove it was real, Stern had one of the most famous historians alive on their side. A British professor who had personally investigated Hitler's death in 1945. He had already told a newspaper the diaries were authentic. Then the cameras rolled. The professor took the microphone, and in front of the world's press, he said he had changed his mind. He was no longer sure. The room went cold. Stern's executives just sat there. 11 days later, the German Federal Archives ended it. The paper was post-war. The ink was post-war. The writing was less than 2 years old. Every single volume was fake, and the whole world had fallen for it. The man behind it was not a master criminal. He was a shop owner in Stuttgart, with a police record for stealing fruit and tobacco. He could barely spell. He wrote 3 diaries in a weekend. He even put the wrong initials on the front cover, and for 2 years nobody noticed. But before we get to him, you need to know why anybody believed missing Hitler papers existed in the first place. The 20th of April 1945. Hitler's 56th birthday. Soviet troops were closing on Berlin. Martin Bormann ordered the last favored staff flown out of the bunker, and 10 aircraft lifted off from Gatow airfield. The final plane carried 10 heavy chests, guarded by Hitler's personal valet, a sergeant named Wilhelm Arndt. It never arrived. It came down in a forest near the Czechoslovak border and burned. Locals stripped the wreck before soldiers sealed it. When his pilot told him, Hitler said he had trusted Arndt with documents that would show the future the truth about everything he had done. Nobody ever learned what was in those chests. For a forger, that is a perfect gap. Which brings us to Konrad Kujau. Born in 1938 near Dresden, the son of a shoemaker, in a house where both parents had joined the Nazi Party. He grew up worshipping Hitler and never really stopped. His early life was small-time crime. A stolen microphone from a youth club sent him running to West Germany in 1957. After that came stolen tobacco, stolen cognac, stolen crates of fruit, and short stays in jail. He also started inventing himself. New name, new birth date, a whole new past. His first real forgery was pathetic, 27 marks of luncheon vouchers. He was caught immediately and spent 5 days locked up. Then in 1970, he visited relatives back east and noticed something. Ordinary families there were quietly sitting on Nazi souvenirs, illegal to own and worth almost nothing. In Stuttgart, the same objects sold for 10 times the price. So he smuggled them west and opened a shop in 1974. Then he learned the trick that would make him rich. You do not fake the object. You fake the piece of paper that says who owned it. His methods were crude. Cold tea poured over pages. Modern stick-on lettering for official headings. Spelling mistakes everywhere. Then he got bolder and started painting pictures he sold as genuine Hitler originals. Nobody checked any of it. Then he copied all of Mein Kampf out by hand and sold it as an original manuscript, even though the real book was typed. His buyer, a collector named Fritz Stiefel, never blinked. Kujau realized there was no limit. So in the late 70s, he made a diary. Cheap notebooks bought in East Berlin. A month of practice copying the old German script. 2 bottles of shop ink, watered down so they ran through a modern pen. For the cover, he wanted gold initials. He bought plastic letters from a department store and stuck them on. But he picked up the wrong letter. The cover of Hitler's secret diary read FH instead of AH. He added a ribbon from a real SS document, an army wax seal, a sprinkle of tea, and a few whacks against the desk. Stiefel saw it and believed. A former Nazi Party archivist looked at it and called it genuine. Word traveled through the collector world, and it reached exactly the wrong man. Gerd Heidemann was a star reporter at Stern. Colleagues called him the Bloodhound, because once he smelled a story, he could not let it go. He was also obsessed with the Nazi era. He bought Hermann Göring's old yacht, mortgaged his flat for it, started an affair with Göring's daughter, and drifted into a circle of former SS officers. The boat left him drowning in debt. In January 1980, Stiefel showed him the diary, and Heidemann came apart. His editors told him to drop it. Only one colleague believed him. The two of them traveled to Dresden and found the graves of the 1945 flight crew. In January 1981, he finally got a phone number and asked for a man called Mr. Fischer. That was Kujau. And Kujau told him there were 27 diaries, plus an unfinished third volume of Mein Kampf and an opera. Heidemann skipped his editors entirely and went to the owners, hinting that if they hesitated, he would take it to America. The meeting lasted 2 hours. No historian was called. They approved a deposit of 200,000 marks. Their first meeting ran 7 hours. Kujau held out, so Heidemann came back the next day carrying a uniform he said had belonged to Göring. Kujau agreed and handed over a painting he swore was by Hitler. Both items were fakes. Then Kujau went to work. 3 diaries a month. He once produced a whole volume in 3 hours. On another occasion, he wrote 3 of them in 3 days. Hitler's Inner Life, mass-produced in a Stuttgart flat. Where did the content come from? Mostly one book, a published 2-volume collection of Hitler's speeches and public engagements. Kujau simply copied the appointments diary of a dictator and padded it with invented small talk. Then came the decision that doomed them. Total secrecy. Not even Stern's own editors were told. And nothing would be scientifically tested until every last diary had been bought. They agreed to pay first and check later. Meanwhile, Heidemann was running his own fraud inside theirs. He kept telling his bosses the price had gone up. 85,000 a volume, then 100,000, then 200,000. Kujau never saw most of it. The warnings were already there. Heidemann read entries aloud to a former SS general who told him the details were simply wrong. Wrong barracks, wrong regiment name. Heidemann decided Hitler must have written his plans, not his actions. A bigger warning came from the poems. Kujau had forged a batch of poems by Hitler, and one turned out to be the work of a real published German poet. Suspect pages went to prosecutors. Stern's bosses continued anyway. Eventually, they did commission handwriting experts. But look at how they did it. They handed over a single page, not a whole diary. And for comparison, they supplied samples of Hitler's real writing that Kujau had also forged. So the experts compared a Kujau forgery with a Kujau forgery, and concluded, quite correctly, that both were written by the same hand. One of the specialists could not even read German. The verdict came back genuine. By 1983, the collection had grown past 60 volumes, and it was time to sell. Stern rented a vault in a Swiss bank, filled it with Nazi relics and manuscripts, and invited the world's biggest publishers to come and look. Then came the man whose name would carry the whole thing. Hugh Trevor Roper was one of the most respected historians alive. He had investigated Hitler's death for British intelligence in 1945 and written the definitive book about it. In the vault, he was told the paper had already been chemically tested and proved to be from before the war. That was not true. He was overwhelmed by the sheer quantity and asked himself who would forge 60 volumes when 6 would do. On the 23rd of April, his article ran in the Times. He said he was satisfied the documents were authentic and that some accounts of history might now have to be revised. That article was worth millions to Stern. But privately, his doubts were growing fast. On the evening of the 23rd, with the presses already rolling, the Sunday Times learned he had reversed himself completely. Rupert Murdoch's instruction was blunt. Publish anyway. The next afternoon in Hamburg, the historian cornered Heidemann and asked him plainly where the diaries had come from. Heidemann refused to name his source and told a different version of the story. That was the moment the doubt hardened. So on the 25th of April, in front of the world's cameras, Stern's star witness said the diaries needed proper examination by German experts. He said the normal methods of checking history had been sacrificed for a scoop. Then it got worse. A British writer named David Irving pushed to the microphone, waving photocopied pages, pointed out that Hitler's arm was injured when some entries were supposedly written, and demanded to know if the ink had been tested. There was no answer. Photographers surged, punches were thrown. Guards dragged him out of the room while he shouted about the ink. It was chaos on live television, and the ink was exactly the right question. Stern's lawyers finally handed complete volumes to the German Federal Archives. Under ultraviolet light, the paper glowed, because it held a whitening agent invented after the war. One binding contained polyester, a material first made in 1953. Then on the 6th of May, the full results came back. The ink was not used in wartime Germany, and chemical tests showed the writing was under 2 years old. Kujau had even copied the factual mistakes printed in that speeches book. The government announced it 5 minutes before Stern could. Kujau ran to Austria, then heard on the news what Stern had actually paid, realized how much Heidemann had kept, and handed himself in. His confession named the reporter. Heidemann was arrested. The trial opened in Hamburg in August 1984 and ran almost a year. Heidemann got 4 years and 8 months. Kujau got 4 years and 6 months. The judge said Stern's own carelessness had persuaded him to go easier on both. At least 5 million marks were never found. 2 Stern editors lost their jobs. One of the British journalists involved later explained it simply. The scoop was so tempting that everyone involved wanted it to be true, so they believed. Kujau left prison and opened a gallery selling fakes signed in his own name. He died in 2000. Heidemann died in 2024, broke. The diaries themselves were published in full in 2023, terrible forgeries and the greatest hoax in news history.